Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen. Amen.
Have you ever changed your mind? Like had a really big revelation which fundamentally changed your actions going forward? That is what is happening in our gospel lesson today. Jesus changes his mind and his ministry shifts after his encounter with a Gentile Syrophoenician woman in the city of Tyre. The story starts off with what appears to be a vacation for Jesus. You see, the bulk of his ministry was in Israel, preaching, teaching, and healing to Jews, not the Gentiles. But the city of Tyre is located outside of Israel and has a Gentile, non-Jewish population. So Jesus had no work-related reason to be in this area. It seems like he's escaping into Gentile country to take a breather. It even says like he's trying not to be seen. Yet, even outside of Israel, he's called upon to work. A Gentile Syrophoenician woman comes up to him in Tyre and begs Jesus to heal her daughter who is suffering from a demon. Jesus then does something which to us seems completely out of character. He turns her down and compares her and her daughter to dogs. How can this be? Granted, he does eventually relent and heal the girl, but his initial refusal seems unlike the Jesus we know. What is going on? The key to this story is the difference between Jews and Gentiles. At the time of Jesus, Jews looked down on non-Jews, commonly referring to them as dogs. In addition, throughout Scripture, both in the Old and New Testament, salvation is explained as coming to the Jews, God's children, first, and then through them, the rest of the world will be saved. Jesus knows that the Gentiles are included in God's larger plan of salvation, but not until after having reached out to fellow Jews. So when the non-Jewish woman from Tyre begs for healing for her daughter, Jesus does two things. He compares her to a dog in the common cultural assumptions of the day, and then he reminds her that there is an order to salvation, the Jew first, and then the Gentile. In other words, Jesus doesn't say no to the woman, just not yet, not your time. Wait. He was still in his mission to the Jews only stage of salvation. But this still doesn't fully explain Jesus' answer. I mean, where is his compassion? One thing to note is that Jesus, even speaking to a Gentile woman, is already a sign that he treats her with greater regard than is standard practice. At that time, listening to a woman who was not of one's family was taboo. And she was not even of his religion. But Jesus had compassion enough to hear her out and take her seriously. But to really get at the heart of the story, you have to look at the full sweep of several chapters of Mark. Like, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but there are two feeding stories in Mark. The feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. They were almost identical stories, and they bracket a series of events. There's only one main difference between these two stories, and it's critical. And it's this story of the Syrophoenician woman that really gets at this difference. She causes Jesus' ministry to change. So it sort of begins with the first bracket, the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus is still in Jewish territory, so this is a gathering of 5,000 Jews. And you know the story, lots of hungry people, their bread and fish, loaves and fishes. Jesus multiplies them, there's enough to feed everyone, hooray. In fact, God is so abundant that there are baskets of food left over. And after that, there are a couple of other stories where Jesus is still in Israel. And then there's the story we heard last week where the Pharisees scold Jesus and his disciples for eating with unwashed hands. They're upset with him for violating purity laws. But Jesus' response, this story last week, shows that he doesn't make a distinction between clean and unclean foods. All of this is sort of set up for today's story. Feeding up to 5,000, the Jewish abundance, no distinction between clean and unclean. After this, Jesus leaves Jewish Israel and goes to Tyre, and we get the story of the Syrophoenician woman. He makes a comment about feeding the children first and the dogs later. Then the Gentile woman confronts Jesus with his own actions and words. She says, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Her words are alluding to the abundance he just exhibited with the loaves and the fish to the 5,000. There were leftovers. Surely there are a few crumbs of God's abundant grace left over from the table for a few non-Jews. Her words also pick up what he's just been doing with the Pharisees. Namely, if there's no longer a distinction between clean and unclean foods, why are there distinctions between clean and unclean people? Isn't calling her a dog just another purity law? Isn't he just contradicting what he just said last week? Jesus listens to her and realizes that she is absolutely right. So Jesus changes his mind and heals her daughter. But what is especially striking about this story is the next few stories are now influenced by what Jesus has just realized. He travels from Tyre to the Decapolis, another Gentile region. And when asked to heal a Gentile man, there he does so without hesitation. And there are two healing stories today. The second one, there's another Gentile man. There's no question like, let me address the children of Israel first. I'll get to you. He does it. Gentile man, no question. There's no quibbling about dogs going to the house of Israel first. And finally, in the Decapolis is his second feeding story, the one with the 4,000. Again, thousands of hungry people, and all are fed. The only difference between this feeding story and the first one is that the second story is to a group of Gentiles. So after having been confronted by the Syrophoenician woman, Jesus' mission changes to include all people who come before him. No questions asked. God's kingdom is starting now for everyone. Clean and unclean, Jew and Gentile, there is no distinction. God's kingdom shouldn't have to wait for some. The message of this gospel story is that God's grace is abundant and meant for all. It is inclusive. We cannot say some people are pure and some are not. That some people are dogs and some are not. We cannot make divisions based on race, religion, gender, culture, sexual orientation, political parties, and more. We cannot say that there's a limited amount of God's grace or abundance, and we need to guard it closely to make sure that the wrong people don't get any at the expense of the right ones. How might this thought apply to Emmanuel? How does this apply to our lives at home? How does this apply to our voting? Who is not sitting in our pews? Who is not welcome in our homes? Do we hold back on sharing God's abundant love and good gifts with others? Are there instances where it might be good for us to listen to someone with a different perspective and be open to changing our minds? I think it's one sign of what it means to love another person, to be open to be changed by that person, for them to be open to being changed by you. Jesus knew this, and it was a sign that he loved even the Gentiles. Jesus came to the realization that while his mission was great, it had been too narrowly defined. God's abundance shouldn't have to wait, but instead comes pouring out right now, in any place, to any person who asks for it. Jesus loved the Syrophoenician woman from the beginning. He listened to her, and when she spoke to him, and ultimately she opened his mind, and she caused him to change his mind and his mission. He loved her, he listened. The kingdom is starting now. God's grace is more abundant than we can imagine. God's love is more inclusive than we can possibly believe.